Our speaker today is Allan Rowe. He has a PhD and works as a Historic Places Research Officer in the Historic Resources Management Branch of the Government of Alberta. So over to you, Allan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jackie. I'll just start by also introducing my topic briefly, finding an economic niche, Chinese laundries in Southern Alberta. I know it's Historic Calgary Week. I'm hedging my bets a bit by saying Southern Alberta because I want to speak a little bit as well about Lethbridge. And my case study is from Fort Macleod, where I got pretty deep into the history of one of the laundries there. And that's this picture here on the cover slide is of the Fort Macleod laundry. So I'll be using that as a case study. So we'll certainly be talking about Calgary, but it's not exclusively focused on it. And I want to start by framing my presentation with this quote from Ban Ho, who wrote the book that went with the Canadian Museum of Civilization's exhibit on Chinese laundries in the early 2000s. And he wrote the following: "The era of the hand laundries was a significant period in Chinese-Canadian history. On the one hand, the hand laundry was a product of economic discrimination and labor hostility. On the other, it was an adaptive and accommodative strategy of the Chinese in their struggle for existence, however marginal it might be." And I think that duality is essential, regardless of what city or province you're talking about in Canada. The essence of understanding the importance of Chinese laundries is to view them through those two lenses at the same time. On one hand, they're marginal businesses that reflect the alienation of the Chinese population from the core labor market and the core business market. They're marginal businesses. They have very low profit margins, and no one's getting terribly rich with a laundry. So they are products of discrimination, and the fact that the Chinese are concentrated in this industry reflects systemic discrimination. But they're also spaces that were essential to community cohesion in Chinese communities. And within that larger framework, that power relationship, you have Chinese businessmen operating laundries that also operate as boarding houses. They operate as social spaces. They're essential meeting places for the Chinese communities. So it's at once a product of discrimination, but also perseverance and adaptation. And I think the complete picture of Chinese laundries requires an understanding of both those lenses. So I will be talking in both those contexts. But first, we're going to put the Chinese population on the ground and talk a bit about immigration to Alberta and how does the Chinese population come to settle here. As I'm sure we're all aware, those of us who live here in Southern Alberta, the immigration boom of the 1890s to the 1910s saw Western Canada promoted aggressively by the federal government as the ideal place for people to settle and take up farms and contribute to the growth of Canada. They produced absolutely gorgeous posters like these. I've always wanted some of these posters because I think they're just wonderful. But these are also aimed at attracting families. This build your nest in Western Canada speaks to domesticity, right? It speaks to attracting families who will have children, who themselves will take up land, and the posters emphasize these big open spaces. Now, to be clear, Asia was never part of this campaign. Immigrants from China, Japan, India, and elsewhere were unwelcome. They were viewed as undesirable, or I might modify that slightly. They were considered desirable as cheap labor, undesirable as permanent settlers. And no group faced this attitude worse than the Chinese population, against whom all sorts of restrictions were put in place. It isn't to say the Japanese and population of South Asia didn't also face challenges, but no group, no immigrant group has faced the sustained restrictions and backlash that the Chinese did in the first half of the 20th century. So Chinese immigrants face unique legal barriers coming to Canada. The most infamous of these are the head taxes, which are passed first in 1885 and then raised in 1901 and 1903. They go from $50 to $500. And when you're getting to $500, you're looking at 2 years' wages for a typical immigrant, Chinese immigrant. So that's a massive economic burden. And what would quite often happen is that Chinese immigrants would borrow this money up front and then have to pay it back. So it didn't necessarily keep Chinese immigrants from coming to Canada. It just put them 2 years in debt. when they got here, right? And it's essential to note that this was not passed until after the CPR, the Canadian Pacific Railway, was completed. So again, welcome as cheap labor, unwelcome as permanent settlers. Then in 1923, infamously, the Chinese Immigration Act is passed, and this effectively bans Chinese immigration to Canada. There's a small number of categories where a small number of Chinese continue to come, but very, very limited. And this effectively bans Chinese immigration to Canada. And I sort of want to make a point here and anchor it with a couple of quotes from John A. Macdonald. It's what's happening here. It's not just immigration bans or restrictions, it's defining the Chinese as being outside of the Canadian nation. So in the late 19th century, Canada is a new country. It's defining what it is, right? And if you're going to define what you are and who you are, you often define that against who you aren't. And when you pass laws like the head tax, like the Exclusion Act, you are effectively passing laws that define legally an entire group of people as distinct, different, and inferior. You're not going to pass the head tax against other populations. You're singling the Chinese out. And I apologize for the lengthy quote, but I really think it bears hammering home with this quote from John A. Macdonald, talking about why Chinese people should not be allowed to vote. And this is in 1885, same year as the head tax is passed. The Chinese are foreigners. If they come to this country after 3 years residence, they may, if they choose, be naturalized. But we still know that when the Chinese immigrant comes here, he intends to return to his own country. He does not bring his family with him. He's a stranger, a sojourner. And that phrase is used commonly to discriminate against the Chinese. This idea that they don't bring their families over. They're sojourners. They come to earn money and then they leave without reinvesting that money. So they don't come here with their family. They don't intend to reinvest the money. And if we go to the end of the quote, he is valuable the same as a threshing machine or any other agricultural implement which we may borrow from the United States on hire and return to the owner. A Chinese immigrant gives us his labor and he gets money, cheaper than white labor, but that money does not fructify in Canada. He does not invest it here. Takes it back and returns to China, and if he cannot, his executors or his friends send his body back. He has no British instincts or British feelings or aspirations, and therefore should not be allowed to vote. So you can see the construction of the Chinese as sort of others, and this sojourner idea is pervasive. And I think it's one of the reasons that looking at Chinese laundries is so important, because Chinese laundries show us that, in fact, Chinese immigrants were entrepreneurs. They were businessmen. They were investing money in the community. And this sojourner idea is a bit of a myth. And it's also a contradictory myth, because if you look at John A. Macdonald talking about the head tax the same year, there was a proposal that women should be excluded from the head tax, which was imposed on Chinese immigrants in 1885. And this is what Macdonald said about the idea of exempting women. The whole point of this measure is to restrict the immigration of Chinese into BC and Canada. If wives are allowed, not a single immigrant would come over without a wife, and the immorality existing to the very great extent along the Pacific coast would be greatly aggravated. I do not think that it would be to the advantage of Canada or any other country occupied by Aryans for members of the Mongolian race to become permanent inhabitants of the country. So in addition to the blunt and terrible language Macdonald is using, he's contradicting what he said about the head tax. The vote. He says, on one hand, they're sojourners. They don't bring their families. Well, let's exempt women from the head tax. What? Then they might bring their wives and start families, right? Like, it's a complete contradiction that just shows the Chinese couldn't win one way or another. They were always going to be viewed as outsiders. So that is meant to sort of give you a sense of the systemic challenges Chinese immigrants faced. How did they get to Alberta? Well, there's two paths that Chinese immigrants to Alberta typically took in the early 20th century. First of all, as I'm sure everyone is generally aware, the Chinese population was heavily concentrated in British Columbia. They arrived with the gold rush in the late 1850s, early 1860s, and then they arrive about 17,000 strong to work on the Canadian Pacific Railway between 1881 and 85. And after the CPR is completed, significant movement of the Chinese east, and Calgary, naturally the first big city on the CPR, east of British Columbia, is one of the places where they concentrate first. And we can see records from Calgary from 1886 and 87 already commenting on the arrival of Chinese. In 1888, there's already laundries in the town. So some of the Chinese are coming from British Columbia after having worked on the railway or come for the gold rush or whatever. There's also immigrants coming directly from China with the intention of settling straight in Alberta. And this would be people who are seeking work. Either there's still a high demand for unskilled labor in certain industries, but also this would be family members to assist in businesses. And one of the things we'll see with Laundries is how they depended on family members quite often for labor. So someone would come over, establish the laundry, and then they would bring over another relative to help with labor and to run that business. So there's a fair amount of immigration directly from China to assist with these business enterprises. And the other thing to make a point of is that immigration from China, regardless of whether it came from British Columbia or directly from China, was overwhelmingly male. The only Chinese women that came over generally came as wives of wealthy merchants who would have comprised a very small proportion of the Chinese population in Canada. If we look at the census data for Calgary, in 1911, for example, we have 482 men and 3 women. So that gives you a sense of the gender imbalance. And again, this reflects back head tax. And if it's going to cost $500 for a Chinese immigrant to come over, families can't afford to immigrate. You set up a situation that makes that impossible. It's just prohibitively expensive. So if we look at the Chinese population of Alberta, we see what we might expect, a sharp rise from 1901 to 1921. And then that steady between, these are census years, that's why I'm going by every 10 years. And what you see there between 21 and 31 is a gradual increase. That would have all been between 1921 and 1923 virtually, because then in 1923 immigration is stopped. And you see it decline during the Great Depression because there's no new influx of people. Now, from 1921 onward, Alberta accounts for about 9% of the Chinese population in Canada. It's still overwhelmingly concentrated in British Columbia, but it is spreading out. There's a time where it's essentially 99% in BC, but now you're starting to get, about 9% in Alberta and the other prairie provinces and some in Ontario. So the 20th century really is a story of the distribution of the Chinese population across Canada. And of course, that's anchored by the arrival of new immigrants after the Exclusion Act was repealed finally in 1947. So this is what the Chinese population looks like in general. So if we just give an overview here of Chinese settlement in the early 1900s, it increases steadily after 1900, despite those barriers to immigration that I spoke of. Chinese settlers were attracted by the booming economy and new opportunities. And here's one of the things that makes the Prairie West and indeed Alberta distinct, is for Chinese immigrants interested in opening businesses, there was often very few opportunities to do so in the long-established Chinese communities in Victoria and Vancouver and some other British Columbian cities, quite simply because those Chinese arrived so much sooner, large-scale merchants set up shop, and there are fewer opportunities. But what's happening in the Prairie West? Well, the railways are being built. Small towns are popping up overnight everywhere. So in addition to Calgary, Edmonton, Lethbridge, Medicine Hat, you also have small towns popping up everywhere. And the distinct feature of prairie settlement for the Chinese is their appearance in these tiny little towns across Alberta where they open laundries and restaurants. And that's what I mean by the fluid environment. Things are moving so fast, new communities are emerging so fast that there are economic niches to be filled, and they can sort of swing in and do that. So the rapid growth of new urban centers provided opportunities for Chinese entrepreneurs and Chinese workers. So that's why we see a steady increase in the Chinese population of Alberta and indeed its bigger cities, which is going to bring us to the second topic here, generally speaking, that is Chinatowns. And of course, laundries are essential to this because Chinatowns generally coalesce around businesses, right? So I'll go to David Lai again, and his book on Chinatowns, although written in 1988, is still the essential reading on this topic if you are interested in the history of Chinatowns in Canada. you could not do better than to track this one down. It's a bit British Columbia centric because he's based in Victoria, but it gives insight on Chinatowns all across the country. It's a fascinating read. And this is what he says. In the past, a Chinatown was a self-contained urban enclave where nearly all Chinese people, their businesses, and their social institutions were confined. Physically and functionally, it's a town within a town. In the old days, Chinatown was regarded by the white community as a segregated, mysterious ghetto of prostitution, gambling, opium smoking, and other vices, but it was considered by the Chinese people as a home where they could find pleasure, comfort, and companionship. It's a sanctuary where they were secure from threats and discrimination. So there's the duality again. When I spoke of what Bang Sang Ho said at the beginning, that to look at Chinese laundries requires looking through the lens of adaptation and discrimination, that's what Chinatowns were. They were places where Chinese immigrants went to seek out familiarity of language, of culture, of place, social connections, cultural familiarity, and laundries are certainly part of that, as we will see. But they were also places shaped by the racist discrimination of the host society. They were often located on marginal or undesirable land. We're going to see that in Calgary. They were often confined to certain areas by bylaws limiting where Chinese businessmen could get licenses. We'll see that in Lethbridge and Fort Macleod. And they were sometimes the targets of racist mob violence. And one of the most notorious of that in Alberta's history is Calgary in 1892, where a small Chinatown had taken root in East Calgary downtown with a number of laundries. And then there was a case of smallpox discovered in 1892. And the city quarantined the people who lived there. They burnt the laundry to the ground. But that wasn't enough for the Calgary mob, who didn't want Chinese there anymore. And when 4 of the people who were quarantined were released, a racist mob of about 300 whites ended up descending on Chinatown and essentially wrecking it and destroying all the laundries there. Now, this Chinatown persevered and existed, but it would eventually move on. That's an example. There's also an attack in 1907 in Lethbridge on their Chinatown that causes it to relocate and so forth. So we'll get into that. So Chinatowns often emerged around clusters of Chinese-owned businesses. Wealthier merchants would typically open grocery stores, restaurants, and then the laundries were opened by smaller scale merchants. But these businesses acted as magnets for further settlement. So they become the cores of Chinatowns, right? And by the 1910s and 20s, these would be further anchored by social, political, and cultural buildings, political associations. Chinese immigrants to Canada were deeply invested in the politics of the homeland, which were very fluid. The revolution in 1911, and then a lack of settled certainty after that, giving way to sort of chaos and civil war. And also voluntary and benevolent associations, which are characteristic of the Chinese communities. So if we look at the map provided by David Lai in his book, Calgary is a bit of a unique situation because it has 3 Chinatowns. The first one there on the right of the screen, you can see is where the mob attacked in 1892. That one persevered. There's about a dozen buildings still there in 1909 that are Chinese owned. There was a second Chinatown, which you can see in the bottom left corner, which was established around a mission set up by the pastor of Knox Presbyterian Church. It had about a dozen businesses, but both of those will be dislocated in 1910 when property values along that stretch skyrocketed. And essentially, both those small core Chinese communities are displaced because the property values get to the point where they get bought up by white landowners and essentially the Chinese businesses are evicted. So the third Chinatown takes root where we know it at Center Street near the Bow River, and that becomes the core of their sort of final Chinatown in 1910, the one that endures. And if you look at, but this was considered marginal land. Downtown Calgary, the prime land was down by the CPR station. So the fact that they were pushed all the way to the north of downtown is evidence, again, of the Chinese being pushed to marginal land. And if we look at fire insurance plans, we can see those Chinese businesses along Center Street and 2nd Avenue. You can see there's a lot of grocers. We've got a Chinese, the Masonic Lodge. You've got laundries, tailors, pretty much a whole community right there. Lethbridge is an interesting case. I'm just going to briefly talk about it. I mentioned that there was racist violence against the Chinese in Lethbridge. Actually, Christmas Day 1907, there is a fight that breaks out between a Chinese cook and a white patron, which led the cook to fight back and injure the white patron, which led a mob to descend on Chinese-owned businesses in downtown Lethbridge and trash them. So very shortly after late 1907, we get the emergence of Chinese businesses in essentially the edges of town near where the coolies were, which is not good land to build structures on. And then that's reinforced by a bylaw, which said Chinese businesses could only locate west of 4th Street South. So you can see the big map on the right, and then the circle shows the concentrated area of what becomes 2nd Avenue South becomes the concentration. And that is a fantastic place to this day. It still has several businesses that predate 1914. It has the Chinese Freemasons building. It's a really well-preserved and cool place. But again, the thing that makes the situation so distinct on the prairies is these small towns that emerge. And if you look at the fire insurance plan for Okotoks in 1905, you see Chinese laundries pop up here and there, but there's no concentration of them because there's not enough of a critical mass of the population to create a clustered settlement, basically, right? So laundries are just found along Main Street, and that's a distinct feature of the prairie experience for the Chinese. You would not see that in big cities or even largely in small town British Columbia. You see it in the prairies, though, where they're locating on Main Street alongside white-owned businesses. So Chinatowns, to sum this up, are characteristic of the Chinese-Albertan experience in large urban centers like Calgary, Edmonton, Medicine Hat, but don't reflect the reality of Chinese businessmen who settled in small town Alberta. So when we speak of the Chinese experience, it's easy to focus on the big towns and the big urban centers, but in reality, it's a provincial experience and it goes into all sorts of small towns as well. So what about laundries, the topic of the day? They were among the most common businesses opened by Chinese businessmen for a variety of reasons. They had very low overhead. It didn't cost much to build one. It was unskilled work. You didn't have to have much training to become a laundryman. There was high demand for the service because this is largely a male society. So even among the non-Chinese population, you have a sizable gender imbalance in favor of men. And they were easy to sell or transfer to another party. And this happens quite a bit, is laundries being established and then sold with the hopes of the second person building it further and making a bigger profit. So the concentration of the Chinese in laundries reflected that alienation of the Chinese from the core labor market. And they were social spaces as well, places where Chinese would meet to talk, to read newspapers, to gamble, to socialize. And the sort of foundational period here is 1886 to 1900. 15 laundries are established by Chinese businessmen in Alberta. Half of those are in Calgary, 3 in Medicine Hat, 2 each in Edmonton and Fort Macleod. So because of their earlier concentration, because of their position along the CPR, Calgary ends up with larger population and number of laundries. Now, Peter Lee, who's a sociologist who's worked on the Chinese, characterizes Chinese laundries as a so-called ethnic business. The type of business organization associated with an ethnic or immigrant community, small firms owned and operated by minority members that are located in a limited number of specialized markets, such as retailing and food services. So they're small scale, as I said. It costs about $500 to start one in the 1920s. They're labor intensive. A typical laundryman would be working 11 to 12 hours, a minimum in a workday. They depended upon family or other connections for their labor. And they were businesses that could also provide housing for the merchant, their family, if, again, typically they wouldn't be bringing their wives over unless they were wealthy merchants, but family members like brothers, cousins, in some cases, sons, and other members of the community. Now, if you look at the census, you can see some of these stories play out in documentary form. This is the census entry for Yi Wing and Yi He, who operated a laundry at 413 2nd Street West. You can see it there. And you can see on the head there that or at the top strip, that the head of the household is Yi Wing, and then his brother is living with him and helping operate the laundry. You can see that at the right-hand side. And if you go to the second strip, you can see he's 29, and then the brother is 35, and that they arrived in Canada. The first comes in 1914, I think that says, and the second in 1920, directly from China. So this is an example of that sort of chain migration where one settler would come and establish a business and then call for assistance from a family member, which then brings another over, and then they work together in common pursuit of that business. Now, this is an underestimation of laundries in Calgary, I'm quite sure, but I went through the Henderson directories from 1910 to 40, and I kept track of the laundries that were clearly identified as Chinese, either because of the name of the proprietor or because they're identified as such in the Henderson directory. This is certainly an underestimation, because some of the laundries listed in there may have been Chinese and it wasn't noted. And also, the Henderson's directory doesn't capture every single business. It's like, for those of us like me of a certain age, it's like using the yellow pages to try and get a sense of business history. Well, it's giving you insight, but not every single business would advertise in the directory, right? But anyway, the general pattern is what you would expect. A boom in laundries peaking in 1914. You get a gradual decline during World War I, which you would expect. There's no new Chinese immigration to Canada in that period, and demand goes down. Then there's a recovery after the war. It sort of bottoms out in 1920, then increases until 1923 when you see the Exclusion Act brought in, and then gradually they go into decline. So in part, the decline is a product of the lack of new immigration. In another degree, it is because electronics, like technology, is taking over, and hand laundries are no longer required. So there's an obsolescence involved with the old Chinese hand laundries. But you can see here growth of laundries in Alberta and then decline. They peak in 1931. There's 3,875 Chinese in Alberta and 566 laundries. But you can see how it bottoms out over the course of the Great Depression, which of course imposed its own particular challenges to Chinese and other businessmen across the province. And not surprisingly, the number of laundries goes down substantially. So now I'm going to talk a bit about a laundry that I worked on in Fort Macleod, and I'm going to use it as a bit of an intensive case study. And my point here is to show how these structures are important and how they can reveal a great deal. That much of the research I've been talking about to this date is secondary source research done by other historians, but to really get at the essence of why these buildings are important, we need to look at the lens, look at them through the lens of one specifically, and what it can tell us, and why the structure itself is important. And that's this building here, the Kwan Sang Lung Laundry. You can't really see it in this picture, but there was ghost signage underneath that pair of windows and door on the second floor. You can sort of see remnants where there might have been letters. Older pictures quite clearly show Kwan Sang Lung Laundry. When was it built? The earliest reports we got were that it was built in 1898, but we don't think that's accurate. The more accurate date is 1907, so that's the one we went with. This photo is from 2015. As you can see, it's not in terribly great shape. So what do we know about Chinese laundries in Fort Macleod? Well, like other parts of Alberta, there was sustained racist discrimination and backlash. C.J. Reach, who was one of the most prominent businessmen and sort of luminaries in Fort Macleod, said the only solution to one who seeks the prosperity of the town and the country is to employ Chinese only when white labor cannot be obtained. and to deal and trade with them when you cannot do as well elsewhere. The vexed question is a social evil that demands a remedy. So in 1898, the Chinese are being dismissed as a social evil whose presence is not welcome. And then in the same year, you get this essentially an editorial advertisement: wanted steam laundry owned and operated by whites to locate in Macleod and do white men's washing. Such an institution would undoubtedly be well patronized, and provide a good paying investment. So if you look at early media coverage of Chinese settlement in Fort Macleod, you see all sorts of terrible terms applied to them: pigtail, Mongolian, celestial, a drag on the wheel of progress, undesirable aliens. And there is intense pressure placed on town council to regulate their presence and their participation in business. And again, let's just go back to that overarching theme of the Sojourner Myth. There's complaints that the Chinese don't do enough to spend their money in Canada. And then when they try and do so, white business owners complain and say, how dare they be allowed to invest money and operate businesses, right? In 1912, I got this out of one of their town council meetings. There was an application from someone named Yi Sam for a renewal of license. And this is what one of the councillors said. Councillor Swearengin seemed to voice the general opinion when he said, we've got a laundry in this town that employs from 6 to 8 hands, all white people who live in town. We don't want any Chinese to do work on Sunday and every other day. Their licenses change hands a dozen times a year. We want to make this a white man's town. So not even being subtle there, closing very clearly with a statement of systemic racism and white supremacy. So that's the attitude of town council. How does it manifest in practice? Well, the building is located on a lot facing 25th Street. If we look at a map of Fort Macleod's Chinatown, in the bottom right-hand corner, you see the general picture, and then a more specific. That's it there on the left. And you can see it's got a weird orientation. It's built on a lot which faces 25th Street, but it's built at the back of the lot facing the alley rather than facing 25th Street. Why in the world would you build a laundry like that? Well, I think it's because there was a bylaw passed in Fort Macleod penalizing laundry owners who had their businesses on 24th Street. So in 1901, there's a bylaw passed which said no public laundry building may house lodgers, which was a clear attack on the Chinese because their laundries were more typically housing lodgers. And then in 1905, all laundries on 24th Street pay a $50 license. So what is this entrepreneuring, clever Chinese businessman doing? Well, he's not setting up his store on 24th Street, which is the bigger street. He's setting it up on a lot facing 25th, but he's turned it around so that it's facing 24th and visible from 24th Street. Now, I can't prove that decisively. We don't have a piece of evidence that says, this is what my intention was, but it's awfully interesting circumstantial evidence that this bylaw is passed in 1905, the laundry is likely built in 1907, and it is facing an alley rather than the main street, which is an interesting observation. So that, to me, is a case of where location can tell a story, right? Just noting where that building is tells us a lot about both the discrimination and the adaptation. And then that discrimination in terms of a bylaw punishing laundries extends down 15th Street. That's the blue line there. And you can see the red and green, those are all Chinese-owned buildings. So they're targeting Chinese buildings. So the building's odd orientation may have been an attempt to evade the $50 law. I've already gone over that. So let's go back to the census and learn a little bit about the man, because as I said, we're only going to understand laundries if we take that larger context of discrimination and understand how Chinese immigrants worked within those confines. So you can see Lung Kwangsang. There is the head. He's 37 years old. He came from China in 1902. He might have arrived from China. He might have arrived from the United States. His immigration in 1902 could have been from California, for example, into Canada. So we don't know if he arrived in Alberta. He names one of his businesses the BC Cafe, which made me wonder perhaps if he settled in BC first. He was listed as a retailer and a restaurant owner. He could read and write English, which was interesting. And he was a member of the Anglican Church, which was very common for many Chinese businessmen to convert to a Protestant religion for respectability in the town. But generally speaking, that was also blended with Chinese religion and tradition back home. So it was sort of a hybrid. It was something you did for the purpose of respectability in the town. But he also has a family member listed there as a lodger assisting with laundry. And what's interesting is that these two, they're brothers, owned a variety of businesses. We can see here the BC Cafe, which lists Kwan Sang Lung as the proprietor, and then another one where they advertise ice cream, where it's the Kwan Sang Lung brothers. So they're offering all sorts of different little confections and such. And then 1913, we see them getting a building permit for a washroom in the laundry, because that was required by law that all laundries had to have a washroom in them. And then in 1916, they acquire the pool room on lot 28, north side of 18th Street West. So these are business owners who operate 3 businesses. And you can see them here in black. The laundry, 1907, BC Cafe by 1911, that's black on 24th Street. And then the pool hall down there, which rested along 2nd Avenue and 18th Street. So again, attacking the Sojourner idea that the Chinese never invested and weren't part of the economic engine that drove Alberta in the early 20th century, they clearly were. And this is a pair of brothers who are invested in 3 businesses in Fort Macleod during its boom years. So we know that merchants in Fort Macleod, Chinese merchants, faced sustained hostility, which manifested in discriminatory bylaws. The location of the building and its odd orientation likely reflects this history. Far from being sojourners, the brothers were successful merchants who invested in Fort Macleod during its period of substantial growth. And as their first commercial enterprise, this building is typical of an early 20th century Chinese laundry. It's wood frame, which means it's cheaper. It's sturdy, but it's cheaply built. It was sturdy enough to still be standing in 2015. It had living quarters. It depended upon family labor. So it is quintessential. It is an outstanding example of a Chinese laundry. So that's up to, we know the brothers owned this building till 1919, and then they disappeared. They moved on somewhere else. So what do we know about the laundry after 1919? We have some aerial photographs of Fort Macleod. You can see in the top left corner, the laundry is there. This is from 1923, but it has an extension. It's the sort of horizontal building. I'm pointing at the screen as if you can see my finger. But you can sort of see, I think you can figure out which one it is. It's been extended. There's been an addition to the rear, which takes it up to 25th Street. But you can still see that alley in between 24th and 25th, and the building, the original front of the building facing the alley. So it's still standing there, but it has been expanded. We can also see it there in this photograph from 1942, both of these aerial photographs from the Fort Museum in Fort Macleod. Very thankful to them for providing that information. Here it is in 1973, and it's still being used as a residence at this point. And you can see the extension there. You can clearly see where it's been built on. So this would be the area facing 25th Street, and then the larger part in the rear there is facing the alley. So the available evidence we have for understanding this building, fire insurance plans, which tell us that in 1919 it was an implement storage place, and in 1960 it was a laundry again, which is very unusual for a building to sort of become a laundry again that late. The 1960s usually, the hand laundries are pretty much gone. We also have a walking tour booklet from Fort Macleod, which is unsourced, but it does reflect community memory. And part of the building was used as a Chinese herb store before 1913. It was vacant during the Depression. but then became a Chinese-owned laundry and boarding house after World War II, which again speaks to its reuse in the 1960s as a laundry. But it's also interesting that it becomes a boarding house after World War II, because what happens is the Chinese Exclusion Act is overturned in 1947, which sees a sudden influx of Chinese settlers. So a boarding house, adapting it to a boarding house again, would have reflected that larger pattern of an influx of Chinese settlers. This part breaks my heart, but we were unable to save this building. It was too structurally unsound, and this was a toll. I put a lot of work into researching this building, and then we weren't able to save it. But what we did do, and I'm just going to close with some of these images, is the building was laser scanned in collaboration with the University of Calgary engineers, and then the data points collected by the laser scanning provided essential information on the building's history. So even when we can't save a building, we can gather data on it and make it available to researchers. So laser scanning revealed partitions in the building at various times. On the second floor, there's no floor plan here for the second floor, but there was clear partitions for residential use that was able to show us the division of the second floor into various rooms and how many there were and so forth. And then there's two partitions on the first floor plus the movement of stairs. The top is the older floor plan where the stairs were in the bottom left-hand corner, and then they're moved to the top right corner. But there's evidence of the partition. It may have been that the herbal store and laundry happened simultaneously before it was an implement store. And then you have more evidence of walls on the first floor later. So the point is, even if we don't know exactly what is going on here, it tells a story of adaptive reuse, which is another element that's characteristic of laundries and Chinese-owned businesses, right? These businesses are adaptively reused and repurposed for various things, which tells an interesting story that goes beyond 1923. So I just wrap up so I can leave time for discussion. Laundries are essential features of Chinese Canadian and Chinese Albertan history. They capture the dichotomy of adaptation and discrimination, and they contribute to the dismantling of the sojourner idea that explicitly treats the Chinese as outsiders. I should just mention one historian, Timothy Stanley, is instrumental in this. He wrote a paper in, I want to say 1996, that called upon Canadian historians to question why we view Chinese merchants as outsiders because they came to make money and then sometimes returned home. There were plenty of Scottish and English millionaires who came to Canada to get rich in coal mining and irrigation projects and railways. And then they took their wealth to their palatial estates back home, yet we call them nation builders. There's a clear double standard there. So Stanley's observation really helped me rethink how we view these businesses, right? And the physical structure tells a story. The location, the odd orientation, the evidence of adaptive reuse are all characteristics of Chinese-owned buildings in this period. So the buildings themselves are important, and we just have to be, we have to listen to what stories they're telling us, essentially. So there's my contact information. If you are interested in touching base with me at any point after this, I'd be happy to chat with you.
Thank you, Allan. That was a wonderful presentation. We already have questions coming in, so let's kick it off. Our first one is from Jill. Do you know anything about the laundry in Ogden that will be demolished soon?
Yes, I am definitely familiar with it. I've provided sort of the information I have on laundries and why they're important to the people who make decisions on the future of that building. So I'm sort of low on the food chain regarding those sorts of decisions, but I've made my research available as best I can. And then those, I don't know what the status is of that building at this point. It's sort of moved out of my purview. And I know the city of Calgary also has work on that too.
So we have another question here. Why wasn't there a Chinatown in Red Deer?
Oh, wow. That's a very good question. I have not researched Red Deer specifically enough to know what the critical mass was of the population. It's one city I don't really know much about at all, to be honest, so I apologize. I know in Lacombe, there were Chinese businesses along Main Street, typical that you would find in the smaller towns. I don't know enough about the population of Red Deer and what Chinatowns usually emerged where there was a critical mass of settlers, and I don't know what the Chinese population in Red Deer would have been. So I apologize.
So when you were talking about the brothers and how they had 3 businesses and that they were they successful in terms of just Chinese Canadians, or as Canadians as a whole? Were their success kind of competitive with everyone else?
No, it's a really good question. I would say that they're more exemplary of the smaller scale merchants within the Chinese community that would have made a go with these businesses. There was more successful Chinese businessmen in Fort Macleod. There's Xiao Sam, who owned a masonry block on Main Street, Fort Macleod, a very substantial and enduring business. And you sort of see this dichotomy with the large merchants and the smaller merchants. And for some, owning a laundry was never intended to be a permanent venture. It was to raise money in the short term that might allow them to go home, get married before they come back to Canada without wives, sadly. So it's hard to know what happened to them after, which is the frustrating thing, right? Did they take this success they had and move on to another town? And we don't have that information, regrettably. So I would say they would be on the smaller scale side. They'd be comparable to any Anglo-Canadian small businessmen, basically, though, in terms of their success. And it's the diversity of the businesses that strikes me as interesting. If they own 3 laundries, that'd be one thing, but to buy a pool room and a cafe is, and it's clear that the cafe was also importing Chinese goods like silks and all sorts of other things like that. So, they would be in the small scale merchant for sure, but as successful as any small scale Anglo-Canadian merchant in the town as well.
They definitely have the entrepreneurial spirit.
Yeah. And that's what's so interesting, because they're coming for the same reason everybody else is, right? Like they're treated as outsiders, but there are these opportunities, the fluid social environment. Fort Macleod's a small place, and there's opportunity to come in and establish these businesses, right? It's so cool.
Yeah. So Tegan's question is, how did the lack of Chinatown in small towns change how small towns populations interacted with the Chinese communities versus in large cities?
That's a great question. Generally speaking, and I don't want to make an absolute statement because there could be cases I'm not aware of, but you don't see the outbreaks of violence. You don't see, in a place like Okotoks, the Chinese laundry getting attacked at any time. So there's greater integration. And of course, we don't have the voices of the Chinese merchants themselves to tell us how they felt. Did they feel welcome? Did they feel part of the community? But in terms of, like, you never see discriminatory bylaws passed in small towns. You never hear about the mob violence. So it strongly suggests that these things were a product of the larger scale settlement. Now, when you read community histories, like a lot of local histories were done in the 1970s, and when you read those, there's often an undercurrent in them of, some people called them this and that, but they all took it in good fun. So, we would like to hear the voices of those Chinese business people in small communities. And some of that work is being done. There's a project underway now about merchants in Alberta that's forthcoming that I'm very excited to hear about, because it captures a lot more of those voices, and I'm very excited to see those. But generally speaking, as an outsider's view, there was less violence, seemingly more integration.
Bonnie asks, apparently An evaluation will be done on the former laundry in Ogden to examine what condition it is. Demolition is on hold for the time being. If the historical assessment shows that the building is sustainable, the Green Line team may be willing to change to keep the building. What can we do to help further its preservation?
Well, that's interesting news. Thank you. I think the communicating with the heritage planners in Calgary and gathering information, if there's community information on the significance of the building that can be gathered, gather as much of it as possible, and make the heritage planners in Calgary aware of that, as well as the historic resource management branch as well, because I think hearing those voices are essential. Like if there's community memory of the place, if there's any photographs of the place or anything like that, then that sort of information could really help contextualize and better anchor the significance of the building. Because I mean, Chinese laundries in general are significant. I think I've made my opinion on that pretty clear. But we need to know, how long did it run? When was it established? Is there anything about it that's unique or particular? Questions of that nature. But definitely the heritage planners in Calgary should know, and the heritage resource managers at the provincial level as well.
Perfect. So it sounds like a lot of letters and emails to be sent.
Yeah, and again, I'm saying Calgary because this is a municipal project, right? The Green Line's a municipal project, so I'm suggesting that as the best path, probably. But
perfect. Gary asked, have you looked at the Chinese cemetery and compared names to the businesses?
Oh wow, have not actually. I've never visited the cemetery, but that would be fantastic, because the directories are pretty comprehensive in listing the names of the business owners, right? So the directories do provide us with that foundation, and to know how many of them are buried in there would be really interesting as well. I have not done that, but thanks for the suggestion.
Yeah, maybe the brothers are there. You can find out what happened to them.
Yeah, maybe they ended up in Calgary. Who's to say?
Yeah. Was there anything else, Allan, kind of popped into your head after the presentation that you wanted to share with everyone?
No, I think I communicated what I wanted to. And again, I apologize that it wasn't more Calgary centric for Historic Calgary Week, but it just hasn't been my specialty right now. And I thought that the Fort Macleod example was just so much more. I could provide so much more detail, and essentially that story is probably replicated in every laundry across the prairies, right? Each one tells that story. So I thought if I could tell that story, it maybe sort of would inspire ways of reimagining and rethinking these buildings and why they're important.
Definitely. I cannot say I knew a whole lot about Chinese laundries before this, but very interesting. I would just like to invite Jackie to come back for some closing remarks.
Yes, thank you so much, Allan. For the folks at home, please remember to check out our website, chinookhistory.ca, for information regarding all of the programs still to come in Historic Calgary Week. So thank you so much, and have a great day, everybody.